My name is David Marples, and I've worked in Ukrainian studies for many years. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And I published this book, my most recent book, called Ukrainian Conflict, an Analytical Chronology, in May of this year. And it's the first time I've ever published an ebook. It was published simultaneously both in paperback and online, so it's possible to download free copies. And I published with a publisher from Britain called International Relations, to whom I was introduced by Marta Dichok, my friend and colleague at University of Western Ontario. The book is a collection of essays rather than a thematic book throughout, but it's all based on the period from late 2013 to early 2017. Hence the title Ukrainian Conflict. It's a period of almost complete conflict for the entire period. There are 41 different essays in the book, and they vary in topics from current politics to history, to the Ukrainian economy, relations with Russia, and some pieces are short and some pieces are long. And, by way of background, when I was working on this period first, I was a visiting professor in Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan, and basically had, for the first time in many, many years, 3 months off to do any research I wanted. So while the conflict was going on in Ukraine, I simply studied everything, including the background. So one can find there's some interesting materials, for example, about the so-called separatists or irredentists and their leader at that time, Igor Strelkov, or Girkin is his real name. I provide quite a lot of information on him and his background, his previous writings, and his links with previous incursions of Russian military or quasi-military into places like Bosnia, Syria, and Crimea. So it's a mixed match of things, but I think in a way it's good that it reads chronologically because, the reader can kind of start at the beginning, see what the situation was at that time. And I faced the dilemma whether to, write from the present or simply base the material on what I'd written at the time. And I thought a long time about this, but it seemed to me it was probably going to be more authentic if I left it as it was at the time, because they were my impressions then. So it's more of a diarist, if you like, than someone who looks at the distant past like most historians would. And I think it benefits in many ways from that. And obviously, often there are mistakes in there. I mean, I thought things were going one way, they went another way. You might write off some politician's career, and then next thing, the politician reemerges. But otherwise, I think he's quite successful. And, this format, I think, is the format of the future, because I think bookstores in particular are struggling today, and authors are beginning to depend almost solely on libraries of major institutions buying their materials. But if you publish online, pretty well everybody can read it in any discipline, in schools, in universities, and just the general public. So you're opening yourself up to a much wider audience. And yet the book goes through the same peer review process as any other book. It's sent out for review, there are comments, etc. So, from all perspectives, it seems to me a winning option, other than perhaps that the royalties are obviously going to be much lower than for a regular book. You're not going to make money on this kind of book, but you are going to get much more publicity than for the regular methods. I think, with the increase in social media and our dependence on social media, the number of what you might call instant experts in different areas has multiplied. So I find people writing on Ukraine who have never been there, who've never read anything in Ukrainian in their lives. And suddenly they're on TV, they're talking about Ukraine as experts on Ukraine. And there's no need to mention any names because they're too frequent for this to be a surprise to anyone. and you feel, well, there's perspective needed. How do you put across this alternative point of view? Even if you were, say, bombarding CNN, to get on there, so that you could make your point of view heard, well, you may get 5 or 10 minutes, and you may get shut out by something else if there's another news story comes in. Plus you're on and then you're gone and that's it. But if you write something of this length, it's always there, and it's always there for consultation. Accuracy, I think, is one thing that really irritates, right? There are all kinds of inaccuracies written about, even different parts of Ukraine, where they are. And I think one of the problems with the war that broke out in the east of the country was many of the towns that were being described, probably no one had ever been there or anyone had ever heard of them again, but suddenly they become familiar names. Ilovaisk is one example. And I was familiar with a lot of these towns from trips I'd made to the area in the past. So, I felt a little bit like this was a territory I once knew, and I thought I knew reasonably well, and the same applies to Crimea. I've also been there several times. And suddenly, everything has changed there. Crimea under Russian occupation, it's a kind of closed territory, it's a military zone. I guess it was always a military zone, but much more so now than before. So there is that as well, as an area with which you're familiar and you feel like you've got some expertise in, is a subject of world discussion. And you could say perhaps 60% of it is ill-informed, and maybe 20% is absolute nonsense. So yeah, this is the reason why scholars have written books. The chapter on, Ukraine in 2015, I think it was, is one of the chapters. Well, I might write that differently now. I can see a little better now. Because the more distant you are from events, the better you get to know them, because more information becomes available. And that particular chapter is almost like, something an encyclopedia would ask, well, what happened in Ukraine in 2015? Could you give a summary? And that's basically what I tried to do. The one I wrote a response to the Ukrainian memory laws in one of the chapters, which was about communists in Ukraine, Ukrainian communists, and their contribution to Ukrainian independence. That is a chapter with which I'm really quite satisfied, because I feel that is something that's never really been emphasized adequately since these memory laws came into force. Namely that you cannot simply write off the entire Soviet period as bad, completely bad for Ukraine. Most of it may have been bad. There may have been peaks when things were absolutely awful, without doubt. And yet, there are some positives in that period for the development of Ukraine. And I think, first of all, the 1920s is one of those periods where, for whatever reason, for Lenin's nationality policy being put into effect, mainly, perhaps not particularly benign reasons, Ukraine began to develop very rapidly, the so-called indigenization or Ukrainization period. And the national communists in Ukraine practically broke away from the communists in Moscow. And in doing so, they gave a distance. They established the fact that Ukraine was independent. Ukraine was a different place from Russia, and it was a separate part of the Soviet Union, and that they were in the Soviet Union as a unit, not as part of something controlled by Russia. And, of course, they were later persecuted for this, and virtually all of them lost their lives. That is one thing, the 1920s. And the memory laws refused to acknowledge that. And the second, in the 1960s, during the period of dissidence, there are some figures in the Ukrainian movement who were also communists. Perhaps the best-known example is Ivan Dziuba, who wrote a pioneering book called Internationalism or Russification, complaining about the control of the Ukrainian Communist Party by Moscow. And lastly, from that same perspective, the group that brought independence to Ukraine, and even the leaders of the Popular Front in its first phase in Ukraine, were all communists. They maybe dropped the Communist Party membership at a later point, but nevertheless, to exclude them from builders of independence because they were members of the Communist Party, for me, is simply fatuous. How else were they going to, provide any kind of influence? So that particular chapter I am very happy with. It's a short one, but nevertheless, it sort of uses the work of Myroslav Shkandrij and others who worked in detail on this particular period. But I think the point is worth making. So, yeah, some are more satisfied than others. I mean, some are much more lighter things, where I take a sort of swing. Well, not a swing, but I sort of look at the work of some British journalist who was working in the Donbass, for example, completely taken in by the separatist movement and becomes a part of it. That is not a sort of in-depth work because simply I'm using the stuff that he puts on YouTube to illustrate this. So yeah, but on the whole, so far, it's only been out for 2 months. I'm not sort of falling off my chair with horror that I wrote any of it. And this was a subject of David Saunders' old book back in 1980s. What role Ukrainians played in the Russian Empire and how important and influential they were in the Russian Empire. And you could find Ukrainians, genuine Ukrainians, not Russified Ukrainians, pretty well everywhere in the hierarchy, cultural spheres, etc. And to some extent it's the same in the Soviet period. Ukraine was obviously a victim of the Soviet period, but at the same time, Ukraine was the second Soviet republic. And in the eastern part of Ukraine, the communists built a kind of heartland. In the industrial regions, and the Donets basin being the heartland, also Dnipropetrovsk as well. And many communist leaders either were born in this region or developed their careers in this region. And this remained. This may have been a factor in demographic change in the Soviet Union. In other words, entire areas were built completely anew and then populated mainly by people coming in from outside Ukraine. Some from within, but for the most part, you could say they came from Russia and other republics. And they built their homes there. The closest analogy to that, I think, is the role of the British in Northern Ireland, who came with Cromwell's period, really, in the 17th century, established a base in Northern Ireland and then stayed there. But, in the 21st century, you could not tell these people that they're not Irish. They've been there for 5 centuries. They think they're Irish. And it's the same with the people in this region. They believe, even those who are ethnic Russians, that they're part of Ukraine. And I think that is one thing. In terms of the question of responsibility for past crimes, this is the most difficult subject, I think, for Ukrainians outside Ukraine to grasp. Why they should do that, because for many of them, the main enemy was Stalin. And the argument is that when the Germans came in, this was a means for change in Ukraine, a means to bring about an independent Ukrainian state, so some form of compromise was necessary. But most of these areas in Eastern Europe generally have long traditions of anti-Semitism, partly for demographic reasons, who lived in the towns, who lived in the villages, the relationship between them was often strained. And the Germans encouraged it, when they came into Ukraine. And I think there are many episodes that are being uncovered today that are not based on Soviet propaganda or, agents of the Kremlin spreading lies or whatever. They actually happen, and people are finding out by going to the archives and doing research and then writing stuff. That is not to say, that there are not, as Taras has said, there are not some people who really take the Russian line on Ukraine and have basically followed Russian propaganda to perceive what is happening in different parts of Ukraine today. That's true. But there are, I think, many genuine scholars who found out some of these things and are concerned about it. And I think that is not such a difficult thing to acknowledge. Every country has the same problem at some point. You know, in Canada, we've just issued an apology to our Aboriginal peoples for some of the things that happened in the 1950s, you know. So governments eventually, I think, have to understand their past and not try to create something that never existed or that exists in some kind of ideal imagination. I mean, Ukraine is pushing very much the memory laws, name changes, pulling down various statues, rewriting history books, rewriting the school curriculum. Rewriting, I would say. I mean, I'm not saying it's what they're producing is necessarily correct. Well, you know, simply put, the school curriculum in grade 11 now is basically a history of what Russia's done to Ukraine. I mean, there's nothing positive in there. It's a completely negative list of topics that students are being forced to study. And I think the Institute of National Remembrance has taken on this role of an enforcer of a nationalist perspective on the past, rather than, I mean, okay, tear down Lenin's statues by all means. I mean, why there are 5,000 of them in Ukraine is anybody's guess, right? You don't need them. But think carefully, you know, about who you're going to put on a pedestal next. You know, it doesn't have to be something that's going to cause conflict among people. It doesn't have to be anybody at all at the moment. I agree that, you know, the logical thing would be not to bother with this kind of stuff until after the conflict is over. You know, let's focus on the one thing. But the fact is it's going ahead simultaneously. And the result may be, I'm not necessarily going to say, but it may alienate people who otherwise would definitely be strongly on the Ukrainian side against Russian-backed separatists. So in other words, it's really retrogressive. It's not really working in a positive direction. The other thing about it is that it's taking place largely outside the scholarly community. In other words, the events of World War II are being discussed by a group of young polemicists who never publish in peer-reviewed journals, who very rarely appear in international conferences, mostly because they don't speak English anyway. But that's not always been a problem, right, with the Ukrainian community, because we can always have translators available. And to ignore, in fact, the more senior and respected historians within their own community. And if you look at some of the comments by members of the Institute of History and Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, they're generally negative towards the Institute of National Remembrance's interpretation of events of World War II. One example, Viatrovych, the director of this institute, has blamed Poland for the current abyss, if you say, in Ukrainian-Polish relations. Poland is an important ally of Ukraine. Poland is the path into the European Union for Ukraine. It's obvious, right? It's by far the biggest of the East European states in the European Union. Without Poland, there's no path forward. Poland will never accept any kind of whitewashing of the events of 1943 in Volhynia, of massacre of civilians by a branch of UPA. So to argue as Viatrovych does that, you know, either this never happened or it was part of a general conflict or there are different views about it, is never going to cut much ice with the Poles. And that's, you know, just one example. And yet the relationship with Poland, no matter what the Poles are doing, because I admit that the Poles are, at the moment, are as chauvinistic as one could get in terms of their government polemics. But the relationship has to be built with Poland, and you don't start by coming out with nonsense like that. You start with a round table of Polish and Ukrainian historians having a discussion, debating where we are at the moment, and that doesn't happen while you get this kind of antagonism between the two sides. That's why I think it's retrogressive, and it's not just Russia, therefore, it's other countries involved as well. And even with the Russians, I think one has to discriminate to some extent. Not all Russians are supporters of Putin, and not all of them, in fact, many of them, don't like what's happening in Ukraine and are uncomfortable with it for many reasons. So I think, some kind of balance is always needed. The other problem, of course, if you're talking about Ukraine, is that what's really happened, and Andreas Umland pointed this out in an article that came out today, is you've got an oligarchic presidency that's been replaced by another oligarchic presidency, perhaps a more progressive one, a more pro-Western one, but nevertheless still got a group of oligarchs controlling all of Ukraine who are perpetuating themselves constantly in office, which means that the leadership is always a tight circle of people who are in control of various facets of the economy. And in many ways, that's as big a problem as any Russian separatists. And that's completely, to be added on to these questions of history and World War II, etc. I mean, it's all part of the concept of what is Ukraine, right? And is Ukraine sort of let's say the nationally conscious Western regions more or less leading the way in dragging the country forward to, let's say, Western Europe and democratic ideals, etc.? Or is Ukraine something much more complex, multinational, with a variety of political views? Do you want this broader Ukraine, sort of greater Ukrainian concept, or do you want something narrower? And I often think that, in the diaspora, you're all basically from Western Ukraine, right? I mean, there are some exceptions, but the vast majority came here from lands that were Austrian, Polish ruled, and then Soviet ruled. Well, many did. I would say the vast majority. Out here in Alberta, for sure, people came from Austria in the 1890s, right? So their perception of what is Ukraine is obviously going to be different from someone from Odessa, say, or from Donetsk. So I feel that this perception of a larger Ukraine is really the way forward. And when I hear talk about, cut this part off, and when we can join the EU, we'll all be better off and we'll all be happy. I think, no, this is all part of the past. I mean, look at the industrial history of the Donbass region. A fantastic example of a developing industrial revolution on Ukrainian territory. This is part of Ukraine. And similarly, with Odessa being part of Ukraine. Trotsky was born in Odessa. There are many examples of famous people born in Odessa. I would say keep it all. Try and keep this territorial unity, and therefore you've got to reach some kind of compromise between you, right? The whole country has got to be based on compromise. You can't have one point of view prevailing over others. And that is the way I think you have to go forward. And to some extent, I won't say completely, but to some extent it's worked in Canada. I mean, if you ask the same question, what is Canada? I mean, it's very hard to answer, right? The simplest answer is we're not America. And the simplest answer for Ukraine would be we're not Russia. And that may be enough for now. And you can kind of build on that and deal with the communities that are there now. Because they all have different ways of thinking about the past, which is what most of us are involved with after all. So that would be my answer to that. I realized that my position falls between two stools, if you like, because on the one hand, you've got those who were militantly on the Ukrainian side, I would say, went almost overboard in their comments about Putin, Russia, etc. And on the other side were those who felt that were just nationalists were basically leading the way in Euromaidan and now controlling Ukraine. And I find myself not agreeing with either group entirely. In fact, disagreeing on most things. And it puts you in an unusual situation, but in a way, I would say one of great freedom, because you feel like you haven't really gone one way or the other, and you're trying to keep this balance. And it's kind of hard, because your friends are saying, well, look, Russia's invaded Ukraine. We're going to have to protest, etc. But I think from my perspective, it's far more useful to the general public, I would say, to keep this kind of balance and look at the topic from a distance if you can. It's hard to do. It's hard to do because, some of the things are revolting, actually. I think the invasion of Crimea was a disgraceful operation and cynical in many ways. Absolutely cynical, given that, the Kharkiv Accords and previous treaties that have been signed on looking after Crimea, and also the guarantee of Ukrainian independence by Russia in the 1990s, along with the United States and the UK. I mean, they guaranteed Ukraine's security and then take the territory themselves. But having said that, there are things on the Ukrainian side that I think have been mistaken as well. And I think it's necessary to point that out. So, I hope, to continue to observe Ukraine. I mean, the book doesn't end in a way, it sort of stops because, you have to stop somewhere. It doesn't mean that the events have stopped. I would say the logical time to end was the spring of 2017, because apart from a few skirmishes, there hasn't been a major change in the conflict in the east. It's sort of a stalemate, waiting for more discussions, etc. But clearly, with neither side satisfied with the current outcome. Well, first of all, that you can get it online. If you go to International Relations website, you can download it and then, print it out or read it on the screen, whatever. Second, the origin of the book was my blog site, and the blog site has gone through several stages as well. It began with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies STASU program, of which I was director for a number of years, and that prompted me to start running a blog site on Ukraine. We started in 2007, I think it was, and people like Myroslav Shkandrij was a frequent contributor, and many contributors to this blog site. So that's how it arose. And I think the blog really defines how the book is written. There are some lengthy pieces in there as well with footnotes, etc. But the blog was the style that I wanted to follow. And I think the blog is attractive in many ways because people can sort of read a chapter over a cup of coffee, It's not like you have to suddenly sit down and read some voluminous great thing where you have no idea where you're going after the first chapter. So I think it's simple to read, and I think it's written in a way that is accessible. That was really the intention, that people wouldn't get lost in it, They could see opinions, they could have their own opinions, etc. Now, ebook is conducive to that. So, that's what I would say. It's a way of communicating. It's a way of having a discussion.